In this video, what I want to do is talk about the Education Reform Act. This Reform Act concerns a fundamental shift in the structure, governance, and ethos relating to education in the United Kingdom. It is largely influenced by neoliberal principles which emphasize the marketization, the privatization of education, emphasizing the need for parental choice and competition within schooling. And so we will think about that in more detail when we look specifically at education, marketization, and privatization in a future video. But specifically in this lesson, what we're going to do is examine the nature of the reforms associated with the 1988 Educational Reform Act, or Education Reform Act. And so from a historical context, the Education Reform Act was introduced, again, to essentially make a number of changes to long-lasting effects on the nature of schools, the nature of teaching, the nature of the relationship between the state and education. These reforms aimed to improve educational standards. They also aimed to improve the increase in accountability, to create a more flexible and competitive system within schooling. However, the consequences were multifaceted, and so we should not just examine the consequences through the lens of the impact that it had on education, but we also have to think about the sociological impact that it had on social stratification, inequality, gender disparities, etc., etc., etc. So all of these things are very important for the Education Act of 1988. It marketized education, it was influenced largely by neoliberal principles, and it emphasizes competition and parental choice. And so when we think about key aspects of the Education Act, we can see that one of the main elements that is introduced with this piece of legislation is the concept of a national curriculum. Now, the national curriculum was introduced for the first time in the 1988 legislation, and what this national curriculum did was standardize what students across England would be taught from Key Stages 1 all the way to Key Stages 4. The ultimate aim here was to ensure that all students, regardless of where they lived, would receive a broad, consistent, and high-quality education. So this is a little bit different to the 11 plus exam that we saw when thinking about the tripartite education system from the 1940s. And so the national curriculum specified subjects, topics, and learning goals for each age group, including the traditional subjects such as English, mathematics, and science, as well as history, with a focus on literacy and numeracy. It aims to raise the educational standards by making sure that all schools followed a set of core content and that all students would progress from a measure that would be consistently understood. Now, that was the purpose of introducing a national curriculum. Well, what about the impact? Well, it contributed to the raising of the profile of subjects such as literacy and numeracy, so these became far more focused on than previously. But it also created a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to education, and critics argue that this did not suit the needs of every single student, particularly when we think about students with special educational needs or those who would prefer and aimed to situate themselves on more vocational tracks. There was also an increase when it came to the pressure on teachers to ensure that all students performed well within the prescribed curriculum. This would then lead to a narrow focus on core subjects at the expense of others. One of the main critiques was the expense of things like the arts and the humanities because of the focus on the literacy and the numeracy. A secondary impact of the Education Reform Act is on the issue of standardization testing and assessment. This was one of the most significant features of the post-1988 reforms. The first assessment would be at Key Stage 1, ages 7 to 8, and then you would have Key Stage 2 standardization, which took place at ages 10 to 11, with the intention of measuring the educational progress of students and holding schools accountable for the outcomes of students. Further on, we see the introduction, slightly prior to the Act, of the General Certificate of Secondary Education, GCSEs. These were expanded and made more standardized, which ensured students' performance would be evaluated based on the examinations at the end of Key Stage 4, which is ages 14 to 16. So the first GCSEs began in 1986, and the first exams for those GCSEs took place in 1988. So an additional element of this was the fact that there were the introduction of league tables for schools. This would rank schools based on the academic achievements of their students, particularly when it came to things like GCSE results, something that is still in place to this day. And the intention here was to not only create transparency, but also to create competition among schools in order for us to have this sort of idea of education being represented as a marketized principle, the idea of marketizing and privatizing education. The impact of this was that there was an increased reliance on testing and league tables, which led to the phenomenon of teachers teaching to the test, as schools and teachers became focused primarily on subjects and content likely to appear in the exam, rather than trying to imbue students with broader educational outcomes and experiences, teaching a specification, like I'm doing right now, rather than teaching more broadly and more abstractly. This was all part of the shift towards the emphasis placed on quantifiable achievement when it came to standardized tests. The result was that this heightened the focus on academic success, as well as reinforcing a narrowing of the curriculum, which would then, as a result, disproportionately affect schools in disadvantaged areas with lower overall exam scores. League tables, while intended to improve school quality through competition, also had the sort of external effect of increasing social segregation. Parents with more resources and social capital were better able to navigate the system and to choose schools that performed well in these league table rankings, leaving the underperforming schools to serve students from more disadvantaged backgrounds, leading to social segregation. An additional impact of the Education Reform Act was in relation to social autonomy and management. The new legislation introduced significant changes to the ways in which schools were governed, most notably increasing their autonomy. For example, schools were no longer directly managed by local education authorities, or LEAs, but instead could now have more control over their own curriculum, budgeting, and staffing. Schools were also encouraged to adopt a self-managing model. The aim here was where you have head teachers and governors that would have more authority to manage the budgets, to hire staff, and to set educational policies. We also see reforms lead to the creation of grant-maintained schools, or GMSs, as well as city technology colleges, both of which operated outside of local authority control. These schools were ultimately funded directly by the central government and had more freedom in terms of their curriculum, their management, and their teaching models. So the key part of this reform was also the introduction of this idea of having local management of schools, which provided schools with much more greater financial control and decision-making authorities and decision-making powers. The impact of this, of course, was that the aim here was to try and have freedom of innovation. But freedom of innovation was not always accompanied by the sufficient resources necessary for that particular innovation, i.e. leaving schools in poorer areas struggling to match the capabilities of the more affluent schools. In addition, we also have to think about the idea of decentralization of school management, meaning that essentially school funding was increasingly linked to student enrollment, which drove competitive approach within schooling, with more affluent catchment areas being able to generate more income and offer better services as a result. The diversification of schools, such as, for example, the creation of academies, of free schools, and of city technology colleges, created an educational system that would become more fragmented, leading to a situation where a growing number of schools operated independently outside of local government control, sometimes with selective entry policies. And then finally, on this particular issue, we have the idea of social stratification, accountability, and marketization as well. So, when we think about this area, marketization essentially, arguably, deepened social inequality in these areas. Okay, so a central theme of the reforms was the idea of parental choice, the introduction of school league tables combined with the expansion of school choice, all was intended to increase the competition and to provide parents with more power to select schools for their children based on published performance data. Now, the government also introduced an open enrollment process, meaning that parents could apply to schools outside their immediate catchment area, further increasing the competitive nature of school selection. Now, this was part, like I said, of this sort of wider marketization of education, because it was seen here that schools were to be encouraged to behave more like businesses for competing students, and schools were expected to market themselves and be responsive to consumer demand like a market would require of them if it was any other kind of market environment. And so the result of this was the idea of social stratification, and marketization ultimately deepened social inequality. Wealthier parents had the means to choose higher performing schools, either through geographical proximity to those better schools, or through the use of private tutoring in order to ensure that their children's success in entrance exams were maximized. Meanwhile, by contrast, families in poorer areas who had fewer resources and less access as a result to educational capital were left with fewer choices. The result would start to compound itself when we say and think about the fact that schools in disadvantaged areas would often find themselves in competition with fewer resources and therefore had fewer options to enhance the quality of their offering. We also see during this time the accountability, a rise in accountability, and the creation, for example, of Ofsted, the Office for Standards in Education. This again was another major element of the 1988 reforms. Ultimately, Ofsted was tasked with inspecting and evaluating the performance of schools, ensuring accountability and maintaining a standard of education that was acceptable. Schools were subject to regular inspections, and still are to this day, and results were made public, reinforcing this idea of both public accountability, but also to transparency within education. Ofsted inspections increased social accountability, ensuring that schools maintained high standards and helped to improve overall performance in some cases. However, in other cases, there were criticisms that these inspection systems focused too much on outcomes and standardized metrics, without trying to consider the broader social contexts that schools may face in terms of their quality, such as inequalities and poverty in certain areas. So, for example, some schools, particularly those serving disadvantaged students, were found to perform poorly on inspection when it came to the metrics due to forces that were often beyond their own control, contributing to a narrow view of school quality. So if they fail or they get a bad result when it came to an Ofsted inspection, that's not necessarily their fault. That might just be because they're serving disadvantaged students, and there are socioeconomic factors that are associated with why those students are more disadvantaged than other students in other better schools. This idea of a sort of inspector process often led to the pressure on schools to conform to a very prescribed set of standards rather than trying to expand the meaning of schooling to a broader social context, reinforcing what is known as a sort of tick box mentality, constraining the creativity of teachers in these education systems. And so, concluding this, then, the overall impact of these post 1988 education reforms did see potentially some measurable academic improvements in terms of their outcome, especially when we think about literacy and numeracy in the early years. The focus on standardization, for example, and testing would often narrow the educational experience, and so in those areas specifically that were narrowed and focused on, obviously students would improve. However, the focus on measurable outcomes rather than the fostering of a sort of more well-rounded holistic education led to criticisms that many students were not being adequately prepared for life beyond exams. And then in the areas that are more sociological in nature, reforms of this nature exacerbated class divisions in education. Parents with greater knowledge, resources, and social capital were better equipped to navigate the choices available under this new system. The marketization and increased standardization of these schooling principles would result in social stratification, as wealthier schools often had better resources and access to more engaged parents, which perpetually created further educational inequalities. Ultimately, then, the education system became more fragmented as a result of these reforms. The introduction of academies, free schools, and private sponsorship schools led to a situation where schools operated as independent entities with varying levels of resources and therefore varying levels of educational quality outcomes. The conclusion was, therefore, that this idea of emphasizing competition, parental choice, and marketization led to a situation where some aspects were positive and came with some more positive results, but overall led to further class division, educational segregation, and social stratification.